The short film that I will be creating is focused around hitchhiking. It will be a horror piece that will focus on the dangers of hitchhiking, but keeping it fresh by changing the threat. The norm for hitchhiking films present the hitchhiker as the dangerous individual, but I will be swapping this by making the driver the threat. This will make my film more niche in the market and will present another side to hitchhiking that hasn't really been explored through the medium of film. The narrative would be centered on Jason, our protagonist, who decides to hitchhike with an older woman. The scenes would play out with friendly conversation between the two, but as the film progresses, we see the attitudes of both characters change drastically. Lucy, the older woman driver, would come across as friendly and gentle when we are introduced to her, but as the narrative progresses, her true intentions are shown, and we see her become more aggressive and forward towards Jason. Jason would start the narrative chilled and nervous, but once Lucy's persona shifts, he becomes uneasy and agitated. Once the scene in the car hits its crescendo, and Lucy attempts to come on to Jason, the location would shift from being primarily focused in the car to a chase in a wooded area. This would allow for the film to become more dynamic, as it would enable more freedom with camera angles, which would make the editing more enjoyable for myself, and thus make the scene more enjoyable for the audience. The narrative would end with our protagonist escaping Lucy, but eventually succumbing to her by being knocked out with chlorophyll. I chose this ending as I wanted to give the audience a false sense of security, as they believe that the protagonist has avoided her, but then give them plenty of time to realize his fate, whilst being powerless to help him. Through my narrative, I would like to present the audience with the potential dangers that hitchhiking can impart. I feel that not enough work has been done in representing the risk that an individual is taking when hitchhiking. Due to this lack of media, I would like to use my film to bring awareness to the possible danger. As I am attempting to bring awareness, I would like to invoke emotions of shock and anxiety in my audience. This is the primary reason for choosing to make my short film a horror film, as it would allow me to convey the dangers, and by scaring the audience, I have a higher chance of the film resonating with them, as it will be much more memorable in this way. The overall moral or message I would like to convey through my film is to be careful when hitchhiking, and if possible, try to avoid doing it entirely, as you really don't know what you're getting yourself into. For this film, I will be taking the roles of directing and editing. I have chosen to be the director of this film, as I believe that I have the strongest grasp on the narrative and what I want to get out of the film, and so, by taking control of the piece, I will be able to ensure my vision is produced in a manner that I like. This would also prove to be a challenge for me, as I haven't done much directing, especially to the scale this project demands, and so, by doing this, I am challenging myself. For this film, I decided I would go for a confrontationalist style. I chose this style as it allows more freedom in how I approach the cast and crew, and allows more creativity in the piece. Instead of being strict with how I approach the shoots, I would be more casual, allowing the cast and crew to give appropriate suggestions to me on how they would go about their individual roles. And so by granting them this freedom, they would be more happy on set, and so the workflow would be improved, and there is a high chance that a suggested idea could be better than my own, and thus strengthen the film drastically. Directing is only my secondary role, and I'll be focusing on the editing of the film. The film would follow a linear style of editing, following a 3-part story structure. I believe this would be the most appropriate style for my narrative, as it would be easier to follow than a non-linear one. My narrative has a clear beginning, middle, and end, and so by sticking to a linear style of editing, I am ensuring that the piece flows fluently. As the primary objective of the film is to unsettle the audience, I will need to implement certain editing styles to ensure this happens. The first of these would be pacing. Pacing is very important for my narrative. The pacing of the scenes start from being slow and relaxed to being fast-paced by the end of the narrative. As the majority of the film is placed in a car, I would focus on making the pace of these scenes quite slow. This would be intentional, as it would allow the audience to truly focus on what is being said, and due to the uncomfortable nature of the conversation, I would ensure, by keeping the pacing slow, I would allow the audience to remain uncomfortable for longer. I would also be focusing on space while editing this film. As the film is primarily set in a car, I would be trying to make the film feel very claustrophobic. To do this, I will ensure that the scene is shot that the camera is quite close to the actors, as so to give the impression that our protagonist is trapped. To present this in my edit, I will ensure, when cutting between scenes, the scenes are on screen for prolonged periods of time, to allow the audience to truly feel the claustrophobic atmosphere I am going for. By cutting too fast, this idea could be lost, and so I'll be placing emphasis on space when editing my film. In this film, there will be limited transitions. I feel by using transitions such as fade or fade to black, it would make the film appear too flashy. My goal for this is to make it appear as realistic as possible and to make it appear like the audience is a third character who is watching these characters whilst these characters are unaware of their presence. By putting these creative transitions into my edit, this effect I'll be going for would be ruined. In this film, I will be focusing on emotion. I would do this by implementing reaction shots and lingering on them for longer periods. I decided to do this as people are visual creatures, and so by placing emphasis on the characters, as well as the emotions they're experiencing, the audience have a higher chance of caring for the character. Aristotle discusses the theory that an audience cannot be moved without a tragedy. And for the tragedy to truly resonate with an audience, the character facing this tragedy has to be liked. By making the character's emotions the main focus, I believe that my film will fit in with Aristotle's theory, and by implementing it into my film, it should resonate with viewers. When approaching my cuts, I will look for visual cues that my actors produce. By doing this, I will be able to cut the scene in a manner that will appear natural and eliminate the potential for the progression of scenes to be jarring to my audience. I would typically cut the scene after the characters speak to each other, as their focus would be on them, and so the camera would follow their gaze. This is a technique I would use sparingly though, as overuse of it would be visually exhausting. I will also be using audio cues as hints as to when I should cut between scenes. A stereotype of editing is to only focus on the shots involving a character speaking. This is done to bring attention to the character, as well as what he or she is discussing. This can work, but if done for every cut, it will become visually exhausting and does not appear natural. For this, I will be implementing L cuts when the character says something that demands a response from the other character. This would be a good choice for my narrative, as I will be looking at emotion, and by focusing the attention on the character's response, I am able to do this successfully. To visually show you how I'll be approaching my edit, I will present you with some scenes that are similar to the ones that I am looking to produce. The main inspiration for my piece would be The Hitcher, 1986.
The moment you stop for The Hitcher.
The main inspiration I would like to take from this scene would be the progression between the shots. The scene's cuts between the two alternative shots, with emphasis being placed on the characters who are speaking. I would like to emulate the cuts that Frank Arios implemented in this scene, but I would change the pacing. The pacing on the scene is particularly fast, as it consistently changes, and the pace speeds up as the conversation becomes more aggressive. I would change this by slowing down the pace at which I cut between these two shots. I have chosen to do this as I believe by spending more time on the shots, it will allow the audience to soak up the atmosphere I am presenting and become attached to our protagonist. This means I'll be focusing on close-ups, as it would bring emphasis to the character's emotion. By making these changes, I feel that the scene is strengthened, as the emotions the characters are displaying are clearly shown, and our focus is on that. I feel by zooming in the character, I am making it more tense, as well as making the atmosphere claustrophobic and tense. By lingering on the shot for longer, I feel that it adds to the tension by allowing the audience to soak up what is being discussed and experience the emotions that the protagonist is feeling. When composing the first scene for my script, I decided to write it in a way that would allow the scene to be more dynamic and fast-paced. I chose this as I wanted the scene to allow my edit to be more dynamic and engaging for the audience and show off my skills as an editor. I am still torn as to whether I should film it in a dynamic manner or stick with the themes I have used for the narrative. As I was focusing on making my scenes longer to emphasize emotion, by countering this in the final act, it may come across as unsettling due to the contrast in rhythm. To decide upon how I would shoot this scene, I have two comparable comps that show different styles in editing. First is a chase scene from Cherry Falls.
Just split. Cherry Falls.
As you can see, the edit is quite fast-paced, consisting of 8 cuts in 12 seconds. This works for the scene, as it allows for the scene to convey ideas of fear and pressure, with the killer looming behind. This is a common editing style for chase scenes, as it gives the impression that the chase is faster than it is. I could implement this into my chase scene, as it would be more enjoyable to edit and would fit in with the norms for a chase scene. Another avenue I could go down is a chase scene from The Shining. The pace for this scene contrasts drastically with the scene before. The editing of the scene is slow, placing emphasis on the characters instead of the chase. This works for the scene, as it presents Jack Nicholson's character as a predator stalking its prey. This style could also work for my piece, as Lucy would appear as a sexual predator, and the use of limited cuts that show her chasing Jason would emphasize the emotions of the characters, as our focus would be on them. When doing my research, I took these two contrasting scenes and changed their pacing. As you can see, pacing is incredibly important for a chase, as if the speed is either too fast, too slow, or doesn't match the tone of the film, it can distract from the overall piece. As you can see, both scenes benefit greatly from the close-up. The emotions that both characters are presenting are clearly shown this way. The fear and dread the woman is feeling is clearly represented here, as is the intensity that Jack Nicholson's character is showing. By zooming the camera in, the audience can clearly see these emotions and truly feel what these characters are feeling. And I would argue, by doing this, the narrative has been strengthened. Upon reviewing these two scenes extensively, I was still undecided as to which style I would go for. I ideally would go for the faster pace from an editing perspective, but from a narrative perspective, I would go for the slower pace. To help me decide which option would be best, I got an external perspective. I interviewed my friend Caitlin, who doesn't study or practice film, to get an audience outlook. After explaining the main focus of the narrative was emotion, and showing her both clips, she stated,
"The scene in The Shining, there are fewer cuts, so the clips are longer and allow for suspense to build. Also, the camera tends to focus on the characters' facial expressions, so you can read their fear more clearly."
From my research, I have decided to shoot my film with emotion as the driving point, focusing on close-ups and a slower pace in the car scenes as well as the chase scenes. Now enjoy my Rippermatic. Cheers.